Have you ever stood in a gold-plated room while your father called you a mistake of nature? I have, at the Stowell Group's 40th anniversary. He told 500 elites that I was a worthless dropout. They laughed, unaware that the 80-story tower they stood in was held together by a single contract signed by me. This is not a story about violence. It is about how I used the truth to destroy everything he built. My name is Abigail Hartman, though for the last 14 years. That name has been spoken in this city with the same disdain one might reserve for a stain on a silk tablecloth. The air inside the Empire Room of the Palmer House Hilton was not breathable oxygen. It was a suffocating soup of expensive perfume, stale ambition, and the metallic tang of old money desperate to prove it was still relevant. I stood near the heavy velvet drapes at the periphery of the ballroom, watching the spectacle of the Stowell Group's 40th anniversary gala. The theme was meant to be timeless elegance, but to my trained eye, it looked more like a desperate attempt to plaster over decay with gold leaf. The room was a cavern of claustrophobic opulence. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung precariously from the ceiling, their light refracting off the diamond necklaces of Chicago's elite until the visual noise became physically painful. 500 people packed the space. These were the titans of real estate, the politicians who signed the zoning permits, and the socialites who existed solely to be seen. The noise was deafening, a roar of polite laughter and clinking champagne flutes that sounded like the rattling of bones. I adjusted the hem of my dress. It was a simple black sheath, unbranded, purchased off the rack at a department store 3 seasons ago, in a sea of custom Vera Wang and oscillating Armani sequins. I looked like a shadow. I looked like the help, and that was exactly the point. As I navigated toward the bar, the crowd parted. They did not move aside out of respect. They moved with the instinctive recoil of healthy cells avoiding a virus. I saw eyes dart in my direction and then quickly snap away. I heard the whispers ripple through the crowd like a draft. Is that her? The daughter? I thought she was in rehab. No, just destitute. Look at those shoes. I kept my chin level, my expression a carefully constructed mask of dull acceptance. I had practiced this face in the mirror for a decade. It was the face of defeat, the face they wanted to see. Abigail. A voice sliced through the ambient noise. It was high, sharp, and dripping with faux sweetness. I didn't think security would actually let you in. I turned slowly. Eleonora Stowell stood there, flanked by 2 women who looked like they shared the same plastic surgeon. My stepmother was wearing a gown that cost more than most people earned in a year, a shimmering silver thing that was far too tight across the midsection. She held a martini glass with a grip that turned her knuckles white. "Hello, Eleonora," I said. My voice was low, barely a murmur. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of gin and expensive heavy musk assaulted my nose. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my plain clutch with a sneer of absolute triumph. "You are brave. I will give you that," she said, loud enough for the nearby circle to hear. "Coming here looking like that, did you park that rust bucket of yours out back in the alley? I told the valet to keep an eye out for leaking oil. We don't want you staining the driveway of the Palmer house." I had arrived in an Uber Black, having left my actual vehicle blocks away to maintain the charade. But I nodded submissively. "I parked on the street. Eleonora, it's fine." "The street," she repeated, laughing. The sound was brittle. "Of course. And how is the job hunt? Have you found a factory willing to take you on yet? Or are you still convinced you're too good for manual labor?" "I'm managing," I said simply. "Managing?" she scoffed. "You're 34 years old. Abigail, at your age, I was already chairing charity boards. You're essentially a ghost haunting the living." Before I could answer, a flash of camera bulbs announced the arrival of the family's crown jewel. Tiffany Stowell glided toward us, her arm linked with the son of a senator. She was 26, radiant, and completely hollow. She wore a custom red gown that screamed for attention, and on her finger sat a diamond ring that probably weighed as much as my non-existent conscience. "Mother," Tiffany beamed, ignoring me entirely at first. "The press loves the new marketing angle. They're calling me the new face of Chicago real estate." "As they should, darling," Eleanora cooed, smoothing Tiffany's hair. Tiffany finally turned her gaze to me. Her eyes were empty, reflecting only her own reflection. "Oh, hi, Abigail. I didn't see you there. You blend in with the curtains. Congratulations on the promotion." "Tiffany," I said, "Director of Marketing. Senior Vice President of Marketing and Brand Strategy," she corrected instantly, her tone icy. "And it's not just a promotion, Abigail. It's a legacy. Daddy says I'm the only one with the vision to take Stowell Group into the next century. I graduated top of my class at Yale. After all, we can't all be satisfied with whatever it is you do." "I am sure you will do great things," I said. I wasn't looking at her anymore. My eyes had drifted upward, past the chandeliers, past the gilded molding. I was looking at the ceiling of the Empire Room. Specifically, I was looking at the structural bay directly above the main stage. To the untrained eye, the fresco was pristine, but I saw what they missed. I saw the microscopic hairline fractures radiating from the load-bearing pilaster on the left. It was stress fatigue. The HVAC unit installed on the roof 5 years ago was too heavy for the retrofitted supports. The building was settling, shifting imperceptibly under the weight of its own grandeur. It wouldn't collapse tonight, or even next year. But the cracks were there. The foundation was tired. It was a perfect metaphor for the Stowell Group. "Are you even listening?" Tiffany snapped. "I was just admiring the architecture." I lied smoothly. "Of course you were," Eleanora interjected, rolling her eyes. "Always with head in the clouds. That is why you have empty pockets." The lights in the ballroom dimmed suddenly. A hush fell over the crowd as a spotlight hit the center stage. The orchestra swelled and then faded into silence. My father, Douglas Stowell, walked onto the stage. He looked every inch the titan of industry. At 65, he was still handsome in a predatory way, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his tuxedo tailored to hide the slight paunch of age. He gripped the podium with both hands, looking out over the sea of faces, his kingdom. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed, amplified by a sound system that cost $50,000. "Distinguished guests, friends." The applause was polite but enthusiastic. 40 years, he began. 40 years ago, I started this company with nothing but a shovel and a dream. Today, we reshape the skyline of this great city. He went on for 10 minutes, listing accomplishments that were largely exaggerated or stolen from subcontractors he had refused to pay. He spoke of integrity and vision, while I watched the cracks in the ceiling above his head. Then, his tone changed. He gestured to the front table where Eleanora and Tiffany were now seated. "I did not build this alone," he said, his voice softening into a performance of paternal pride. "I did it for my family, for my beautiful wife, Eleanora, who is my rock, and for my daughter, Tiffany." The spotlight swung to Tiffany, who waved regally. "Tiffany, who graduated summa cum laude from Yale. Tiffany, who has stepped up as our new senior VP. She is the future. She is proof that with the right guidance, the right breeding, greatness is inevitable." He paused for effect. I knew what was coming. I could feel the air pressure in the room drop as he prepared the blow. He needed a villain to make his hero shine brighter. He needed a cautionary tale. "But," Douglas sighed heavily into the microphone, shaking his head with theatrical sorrow, "success is not guaranteed, even in the best families. Sometimes weeds grow in the garden." He didn't point at me. He didn't have to. Every head in the room turned toward the back corner where I stood alone. "We all have burdens," he continued, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I have a daughter who chose a different path, a path of least resistance. At 34 years old, she stands here tonight with no degree, no career, no husband, no future." The room was silent, but it was a loud silence. It was the silence of 500 people holding their breath to see if the victim would bleed. "I love her, of course," Douglas said, spreading his hands. "But let her be a lesson to the young people in this room. Talent is nothing without discipline, without listening to your elders. You end up well. You end up empty-handed. You end up a shadow." A ripple of laughter moved through the room. It started with the sycophants in the front row and spread backward. They were laughing at me. The uneducated failure, the disappointment, the mistake. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but not from shame. It was a cold, chemical heat, adrenaline. I did not look down. I did not cry. I did not run out the side door with my hand over my mouth, as I had done when I was 20. Instead, I reached out to a passing waiter's tray and lifted a glass of champagne. I held it up, just slightly, in the direction of the stage. My father was too far away to see the expression in my eyes. But he saw the glass. He smirked, thinking it was a gesture of surrender, a pathetic toast from the loser daughter. I brought the rim of the glass to my lips. The crystal was cold. "Start the clock," I whispered. The words were lost in the applause that followed my father's speech. But I heard them. They were the only words that mattered. I placed the untouched glass on a high table near the exit. The bubbles were still rising, frantic to escape. Just like the people in this room would be in a few weeks' time. I turned on my heel and walked out. I moved with a precision that went unnoticed by the drunken crowd. I didn't rush. I walked with the rhythm of a metronome. Left, right, past the coat check where the attendants looked at me with pity, past the concierge desk. "Ms. Hartman?" a voice called out behind me. It was one of my father's junior associates, a man I had known since high school. "Are you okay?" That was brutal. I didn't stop. I didn't turn around. I pushed through the revolving brass doors and stepped out into the biting Chicago night. The wind hit me instantly, cold and sharp, smelling of lake water and exhaust fumes. It was the smell of reality, the smell of the city I actually built, not the fantasy world inside that ballroom. I walked half a block down Monroe Street, away from the valet stand where the Bentleys and Rolls-Royces were lined up like shiny beetles. I turned the corner into a shadowed loading zone. Sitting there, idling quietly in the dark, was a Maybach S-Class. It was jet black, with tinted windows that absorbed the streetlights. The driver, a massive man named Corbin, who had been with me for 6 years, stepped out immediately and opened the rear door. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He saw my face. I slid into the back seat. The interior was hermetically sealed against the noise of the city. The leather was soft. The air smelled of cedar and leather, and the temperature was set to exactly 70 degrees. It was a sanctuary. I leaned back and closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, letting the mask fall. My jaw unclenched. The submissive, beaten daughter evaporated. In her place sat the CEO of Ethelgard Dynamics. My phone, which had been silent in my clutch all evening, buzzed against my palm. I pulled it out. The screen glowed in the darkness. It was a secure message from Marcus, my chief legal counsel and the only man in Chicago who knew exactly how deep the knife was about to go. The message was short. "Time to pull the rug?" I looked out the window at the towering structure of the Palmer House, then up toward the skyline where the lights of the city glittered. Somewhere in that skyline was the Zenith Tower, my father's pride and joy, and buried deep in its foundation were the intellectual property rights that belonged to me. I typed back a single word. "Now." I locked the phone and looked at Corbin in the rearview mirror. "Where to, boss?" he asked. "Home," I said. "I have a funeral to plan." "Who died?" "No one yet," I said, staring at the reflection of my own eyes in the dark glass. "But the Stowell Group is walking dead. They just don't know it yet." The car pulled away from the curb, merging seamlessly into the traffic, a shark disappearing into the deep ocean. Behind us, the party raged on. 500 people toasting to a future that I had already canceled. The leather seat of the Maybach was warm, but as I watched the city blur past the tinted windows, a chill settled deep in the marrow of my bones. It was not the air conditioning, It was the ghost of a winter 14 years ago, a memory so sharp it could still cut skin. I closed my eyes and let the darkness take me back to the day I died. I was 20 years old. Back then. I did not wear Armani. I wore paint-stained denim and oversized sweaters meant to hide me from the world. I lived in the attic room of the Stowell estate, a space that smelled of turpentine and graphite, while Tiffany was downstairs practicing her smiles for debutante balls. I was upstairs calculating the load-bearing capacity of suspension bridges. I saw the world in angles and vectors. My mother, before she passed, had left me a sketchbook, and I had filled every inch of it with dreams of steel and glass. I wanted to build things that lasted, perhaps because everything in my own life felt so fragile. The acceptance letter from MIT arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember the texture of the envelope. It was thick, heavy, and embossed with a logo that promised a different life. My hands shook so hard, I nearly dropped it. I had applied in secret, using money I had saved from doing homework for the rich kids at my prep school. I opened it sitting on the floor of the foyer, and when I read the first line, the air left my lungs. I was in. Not only was I in, but the engineering department had handwritten a note praising my portfolio. I waited for my father to come home. I prepared a speech. I thought that if I showed him, I could be useful. If I showed him, I had the same mind for structure that he claimed to have. He would finally look at me with something other than disappointment. It was 7 p.m. when I walked into his study. The room smelled of cigar smoke and aged scotch. Douglas Stowell sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing blueprints for a strip mall in the suburbs. Eleonora was there too, lounging on the leather sofa, flipping through a catalog of European furniture. "Father," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and hope. "I have news." He didn't look up. "Make it quick. Abigail, I have a dinner meeting." I stepped forward and placed the letter on top of his blueprints. I got into MIT, the architecture program. Silence stretched in the room, heavy and suffocating. Eleonora stopped flipping her pages. She looked at the letter, then at me, and a small, tight smile played on her lips. It was the smile of a predator sensing weakness. "MIT?" She laughed softly. "Oh, Douglas, look at her. She thinks she is going to be an engineer." My father finally picked up the paper. He read it slowly. His expression did not change. There was no pride, no surprise, just a flat, cold indifference. "You applied without my permission," he stated. "I wanted to surprise you," I said, the hope beginning to bleed out of me. "I can do this. Dad, I can learn to run the technical side of the company. I can help you build better." He stood up, the letter still in his hand. He walked over to the fireplace where a low fire was crackling. "Abigail," he said, his voice sounding weary, as if explaining something to a slow child. "We have discussed this. A woman's place in this industry is in the sales office or on the arm of a partner, not in the dirt, not in the math. But I have the talent," I pleaded. "Read the note. They said, 'It costs $60,000 a year,'" he interrupted. "I can get loans. I can work," I said. He shook his head. "I am not going to co-sign loans for a fantasy, and I am certainly not paying for it. Do you know how expensive Tiffany's ballet conservatory is? Do you know what it costs to keep a horse at the stables for her? We have priorities. Abigail. Tiffany has a future in society. She needs that money to refine her grace. You need to be realistic." With a casual flick of his wrist, he tossed the letter into the fire. I gasped and lunged forward, but it was too late. The heavy cream paper curled, turned brown, and then burst into flame. My future turned to ash in 3 seconds. "No," I whispered. "Sit down," he commanded. "I have already arranged for your education. You will attend the local community college. They have a hospitality management program. It is 2 years, cheap, practical. When you finish, you can manage the housekeeping staff at one of the motels. That is a job you can handle." I looked at him, and for the first time, the admiration I had held for my father cracked. "I won't do it," I said. "You will do as you are told, or you will leave this house," he said, turning his back to me. I did as I was told. On the surface, I enrolled in the hospitality program. I learned how to fold napkins into swans and how to apologize to guests for things that were not my fault. But my soul was screaming. I needed to be near the construction. I needed to prove him wrong. So, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the dutiful, failing daughter. But on weekends and nights, I put on steel-toed boots and an oversized jacket, tucked my hair under a cap, and went to the south side. I found a foreman on one of the Stowell Group's smaller subcontracted sites who didn't care who I was as long as I worked cheap. I hauled bags of cement that weighed 50 pounds. I tied rebar until my fingers bled. I learned the language of the site, the sweat, the cursing, the precision required to keep 1,000 tons of concrete from crushing you. I learned more in 3 months of pouring foundations than I would have in 4 years of hospitality school. And then came the project on Wacker Drive. It was a rush job. A mid-rise parking structure that my father was desperate to finish before the fiscal year ended. I was working there as an unpaid intern under a fake name, organizing permits and checking supply logs. I saw the problem on a Tuesday, the same day of the week my MIT letter had burned. I was checking the support columns in the lower garage. The blueprints called for number 8 rebar, spaced 6 inches apart, but the steel in the forms was number 6, and the spacing was 8 inches. It was cheaper, it was faster, and it was dangerous. I ran the calculations in my head, the live load of the cars, plus the weight of the concrete, plus the vibration from the street above. The safety factor was non-existent. I marched to the site office. The project manager was a man named Miller, a crony of my father who spent more time drinking coffee than inspecting the work. "Mr. Miller," I said, slamming the logbook on his desk. "The rebar in Zone C is wrong. It's too thin. If we pour the slab today, it will shear off at the connection point." Miller looked at me over his donut. "Excuse me? Who are you again? The coffee girl?" "I am telling you the structural integrity is compromised," I insisted, my voice rising. "You are saving maybe $2,000 on steel, but you are risking a collapse." He laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. "Listen to me. Sweetheart, I have been building since before you were born. The engineers signed off on the change. It is called value engineering. Now get out of my office before I fire you." I tried to call my father's office. His secretary blocked me. I tried to tell the concrete crew, but they were paid by the yard and didn't care. They poured the concrete at 1 p.m. I stood by the perimeter fence, watching the gray sludge fill the forms. Feeling sick to my stomach, I knew physics. Physics does not care about deadlines. Physics does not care about value engineering. Physics demands respect. At 4 p.m, a delivery truck drove onto the freshly cured section from the previous week, which was tied into the new pour. The sound was not a crash. It was a groan, a low, tearing sound like the earth itself was in pain. Then came the snap, loud as a gunshot. The slab in Zone C gave way. I watched in horror as the truck tilted and slid backward into the hole. Scaffolding twisted like licorice. Men shouted. The dust cloud rose up, choking the air. I ran toward the rubble while others ran away. I helped pull a laborer out from under a twisted beam. His leg was broken, bones sticking through denim. The sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. I thought, naively, that this would be the moment. I thought my father would see that I was right. I thought he would fire Miller and realize that I had tried to save them. I was wrong. 2 days later, I was summoned to the headquarters. I walked into the boardroom thinking I was going to give a witness statement. My father was there, Miller was there, and so were 3 lawyers I had never seen before. "Sit down, Abigail," my father said. His face was gray, but his eyes were hard as flint. "I told him," I said, pointing at Miller. "I told him the rebar was wrong. I tried to stop it." My father placed a file on the table. "We have the logs, Abigail, the logs that you were in charge of." I frowned. What? The investigation shows that the order for the correct steel was cancelled, my father said, his voice devoid of emotion, and replaced with an order for substandard material. The signature on the change order is yours. My mouth fell open. That is a lie. I never signed anything. Miller approved it. Miller looked at his shoes. He didn't say a word. We cannot have a scandal involving the management, one of the lawyers said smoothly. The insurance company needs a liable party, someone who acted outside of protocol, an inexperienced intern who made a clerical error. I looked at my father. I looked deep into his eyes, searching for a shred of humanity. You are framing me? I am your daughter. You are going to blame me for your cheapness? You are a liability, Douglas said. You always have been. You wanted to play in the construction site. Abigail, well, now you are responsible for it. The company cannot take this hit. The stock would plummet. I warned you, I whispered, tears of rage burning my eyes. You are going to sign this admission of guilt, he said, sliding a paper across the table. It states you made an error in ordering. No criminal charges will be pressed. We have paid off the injured workers. But you will leave this city. You will not speak to the press, and you will never step foot in this company again. And if I don't sign? Then I will let the police handle it, he said. And with your lack of resources, and my lawyers, you will go to prison for criminal negligence. Tiffany has a bright future. Abigail, I will not let you ruin it. I signed the paper. I signed away my name. I signed away my truth. That night, I packed a single duffel bag. It was February in Chicago. The wind coming off Lake Michigan felt like knives. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero. Eleonora was waiting by the front door as I walked out. She held a glass of wine, looking warm and flushed. I always knew you were a bad seed, she said, leaning against the doorframe. Try not to freeze to death, or do. It would save us the embarrassment. She slammed the heavy oak door in my face. The sound echoed like a final judgment. I stood on the porch of the house I had grown up in. I had $80 in my pocket. I had no degree. I had a record of professional negligence. I had nothing. I walked down the long driveway, the snow crunching under my thin boots. The cold bit through my coat, reaching my skin, turning my fingers numb, but the cold inside my chest was colder. I turned back one last time at the iron gates. I looked at the mansion, glowing with warm yellow light, a fortress of lies and greed. I saw Tiffany's silhouette in the window, practicing her ballet positions. I did not cry. The tears froze on my lashes before they could fall. I clenched my hands into fists, feeling the nails dig into my palms until the pain was sharp and real. Enjoy the warmth, I whispered into the howling wind. Enjoy it while you can, because I am going to buy this house one day. I am going to buy this street. I am going to buy the very air you breathe. And when I do, I will turn off the heat. I turned my collar up against the snow and walked into the darkness. That was the night Abigail the daughter died. And that was the night the architect was born. I would build myself from the ground up, one stone of resentment at a time, until my shadow was large enough to swallow them whole. Survival is not a passive act. It is a violent clawing back of the space you deserve in the world. For the first 2 years after I walked away from the Stowell mansion, I did not exist. Abigail Hartman was dead, buried under the snow of that Chicago winter. In her place was a ghost who worked 3 jobs and slept 4 hours a night. I washed dishes in a greasy spoon diner on the south side, where the water was scalding enough to peel the skin off my hands, but I welcomed the pain. It kept me awake, by day. I worked as a welder in an off-the-books fabrication shop. I lied about my experience. I told the foreman I had worked on oil rigs. He didn't care as long as my beads were straight. I learned the smell of ozone and melting steel. I learned how to look at a beam and feel its tension point before I even ran the math. My nights were spent doing freelance drafting for exhausted architecture students who had more money than talent. I did their assignments for $50 a pop, hunched over a drafting table I had salvaged from a dumpster. sketching lines that were sharper and bolder than anything their professors could teach. I was hungry, I was tired, but I was free. It was in a dusty, forgotten corner of the public library that I met Elias Vance. The world thought Elias was dead, or at least insane, in the 90s. He had been the visionary behind the floating gardens of Singapore and the Helix Bridge in London. Then, he had vanished. Rumor said he had cracked under the pressure. The truth was, he had simply grown disgusted. I found him arguing with a structural engineering textbook in the reference section. He looked like a vagrant, with a wild beard and a coat held together by duct tape. He was muttering about load distribution vectors. "The book is wrong," I said, not looking up from my own sketchpad. He stopped muttering. He turned slowly, his eyes sharp and lucid beneath bushy gray brows. "Excuse me?" "The cantilever equation on page 204, I said. "It assumes a static load, if you account for wind shear at that altitude. The torque will snap the support in 6 years. Elias stared at me. He looked at my welding burns. He looked at my cheap boots. Then he snatched my sketchpad from my hands. He flipped through pages of my designs. Brutalist, efficient, unapologetically strong structures. "Who taught you to draw like this?" he asked. "No one," I said. "I just see the bones." "You don't draw buildings," Elias grunted, handing the pad back. "You draw fortresses. You draw like you are expecting a war." "I am," I replied. That was the beginning. Elias Vance did not take me in as a daughter. He took me in as an apprentice, a weapon to be forged. We worked out of a converted warehouse in the meatpacking district. It was freezing in the winter and sweltering in the summer. But it became my sanctuary. Elias was a brutal teacher. He would make me calculate the stress points of a suspension bridge by hand, without a calculator, until my fingers cramped. He taught me that architecture was not about beauty. Beauty was a byproduct of truth. If the math was honest, the building would be beautiful. If the math was lied to, the building was a tomb. "The business world is full of liars, Abigail," he told me one night over cheap whiskey. "They cut corners. They bribe inspectors. They hide rot behind marble. You must be the one who sees the rot." While I studied under him, I enrolled in an online degree program from a university in Zurich. I used a variation of my name, stripping away the Stowell legacy entirely. I finished a 4-year degree in 18 months. I did not sleep. I drank black coffee and ate instant noodles. I took exams at 3 in the morning. I wrote my dissertation on catastrophic failure analysis in high-rise structures. When I graduated, I did not apply for a job. I created one. I founded Ethelgard Dynamics. The name came from an old book of mythology Elias had given me. It meant noble fortress. I did not want to build new towers. There were enough ego-driven architects doing that. I wanted to fix the broken ones. I positioned the company as a specialized consultancy for structural crises. We were the trauma surgeons for skyscrapers. When a foundation started to sink in San Francisco, or a luxury condo in Dubai began to sway too much in the wind. The developers didn't call the original architects. They called us. My rule was simple: absolute anonymity. I hired Marcus, a brilliant contract lawyer who had been disbarred for being too aggressive and then reinstated because he was too good to lose. He became the face of Ethelgard. He wore the suits. He shook his hands. He delivered the bad news. I remained in the shadows. I was the consultant, the principal engineer. No one saw me. No one heard my voice. I communicated through encrypted emails and finalized blueprints. Our first major contract was a hotel in Miami that was sinking 3 inches a year. The owners were frantic. I flew down on a private charter. Disguised as Marcus's executive assistant, I spent 4 hours in the basement, crawling through mud, measuring the pilings. I designed a hydraulic shoring system that stabilized the building in 2 weeks. We charged them $4 million. They paid it without blinking. That was the turning point. Word spread in the high-stakes world of real estate development. There was a ghost firm that could fix anything. Provided you paid their exorbitant fees and signed their ironclad non-disclosure agreements, money began to pour in. It was not a trickle. It was a flood. I worked with a ferocity that bordered on madness. In 10 years, I fixed 42 major structures across 3 continents. I saved billions of dollars in assets. My bank account grew from 0 to 7 figures, then 8, then 9. I surpassed my father's net worth when I was 31. He was leveraging debt to build glass boxes. I was dealing in liquid cash to save them. But I did not buy yachts. I did not buy islands. I bought a single property, directly across the river from the Stowell Group headquarters. There was a historic limestone building. It was taller than my father's office by 10 stories. The penthouse had been vacant for years. I bought it for $18 million in cash. I gutted it. I removed the gold fixtures and the marble floors. I replaced them with polished concrete and exposed steel. I turned the entire living room wall into a floor-to-ceiling window that looked directly into my father's office across the river. I bought a telescope, high-powered, military-grade, every morning. I would drink my tea and watch Douglas Stowell pace in his office. I watched him yell at subordinates. I watched him panic as his stock prices fluctuated. I learned his routines better than he knew them himself. I was the spider sitting in the center of the web, waiting for the fly to tire itself out. My life was solitary by design. I had no lovers. I had no friends, other than Marcus and Elias, who was now too old to travel and lived in the guest wing of my penthouse, grumbling about modern architecture. Then came Justice. I found him on a rainy Tuesday behind a dumpster in the alley where I parked my car. He was a black cat, scrawny, missing half of one ear, his fur matted with oil. He hissed at me when I approached. He was ugly and broken and full of rage. I saw myself in him. I wrapped him in my coat, ignoring the way he scratched my arm. I took him up to the penthouse. I cleaned him. I fed him expensive tuna. I named him Justice, because justice is not pretty. It is scarred, and it has to fight to survive, but it is always watching. Justice became the only living thing I allowed into my inner circle. He would sit on my desk while I reviewed blueprints, his yellow eyes tracking the movement of my stylus. Despite the hundreds of millions of dollars sitting in offshore accounts, I kept my life simple. I drove a 10-year-old sedan for daily errands. I wore jeans and black turtlenecks. I had no social media presence. If you Googled Abigail Hartman, you found nothing. No LinkedIn, no Facebook, no photos, just a birth record and a void. I was a myth, a whisper. My father thought I was destitute. He thought I was suffering. Every time I heard through the grapevine that he had made a joke about my failure at a country club dinner, I would transfer another $1 million into my war chest. I was not just accumulating wealth, I was accumulating ammunition. I spent my evenings analyzing the Stowell Group's public filings. I found the cracks in their financial foundation just as easily as I found the cracks in concrete. I saw the over-leveraged loans. I saw the risky bets on zoning permits. I saw the corner-cutting measures that were keeping their profit margins artificially high. I began to buy their debt, quietly, through shell companies and blind trusts. When a bank wanted to offload a risky loan the Stowell Group had taken out, Ethelgard Dynamics bought it. When a supplier was owed money by my father and needed cash fast, I bought the invoice, slowly, brick by brick. I was becoming the owner of my father's empire without him even knowing it. He was the king of the castle, but I owned the ground it stood on. I remember standing at the window of my penthouse on the night of my 34th birthday. The city was a grid of light below me. Across the river, the lights in my father's office were still on. He was working late, probably trying to figure out why his latest project was over budget. I stroked Justice's fur as he purred on the windowsill. Soon, I whispered to the glass. I had the money. I had the power. I had the leverage. All I needed was the opportunity. I needed him to make one colossal mistake. I needed him to reach for something he couldn't hold. And then, the news broke about the Zenith Tower project. It was the tallest building ever proposed in Illinois, a needle of glass and steel that would pierce the clouds. My father had bid everything on it. It was his vanity project, his monument to himself. I looked at the preliminary designs that had been leaked to the press. I saw the wind load calculations. I saw the soil composition reports for the site. I smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that reflected in the glass. "He is going to build it on sand," I said to Elias, who was sitting in his armchair reading a paper. "Then it will fall," Elias rasped. "No," I said, turning away from the window. "It won't fall, because I am going to catch it. And then I am going to crush him with it." The trap was set. The predator was ready. I just had to wait for the prey to walk into the cage. 2 years ago, the devil came to Chicago, and he brought blueprints. The project was christened the Zenith. It was not just a building, it was an act of architectural aggression. The design called for 110 stories of glass and steel that would pierce the skyline like a jagged needle, looking down upon the Willis Tower and the street. Regis, it was intended to be the tallest structure in Illinois, a physical manifestation of the Stowell Group's dominance, but dominance costs money. And my father, Douglas Stowell, had always been better at spending it than managing it. To win the bid against 3 international conglomerates, the Stowell Group undercut the competition by 15%. It was a mathematical impossibility. Anyone with a basic understanding of logistics knew that you could not build a structure of that magnitude at that price point without sacrificing something vital. Douglas sacrificed the bones. He pressured the procurement department to switch from high-grade American steel to a cheaper import that barely met the tensile strength requirements. He authorized the use of a concrete mix that cured too quickly, prone to micro-cracking in the freeze-thaw cycle of the Midwest. But the fatal error, the mistake that would eventually hand me the keys to his kingdom, was in the foundation. Chicago is built on a swamp. The bedrock is deep, buried under layers of shifting clay and silt. To build the Zenith, you needed caissons that went down 120 feet, anchored into the limestone shelf. Douglas stopped at 90 feet to save $4 million. Construction began with a fanfare that rivaled a royal coronation. I watched from my penthouse window across the river. My telescope trained on the site. I saw the trucks pouring the concrete. I saw the cranes lifting the girders. And I saw the inevitable future written in the physics of the soil. It happened when the tower reached the 40th floor. It started as a rumor on the construction forums I monitored under a pseudonym. Iron workers were complaining that the elevator shafts weren't aligning. Windows on the west face were cracking as they were installed. Then, the surveyors confirmed it. The Zenith was leaning. It wasn't a romantic, leaning Tower of Pisa situation. It was a structural necrosis. The west side of the foundation was sinking into the clay faster than the east side. At the 40th floor, the building was off-center by 5 inches. If they continued to build, the center of gravity would shift, and the torque would snap the spine of the tower before they even reached the 60th floor. Work stopped. Silence fell over the site. The panic inside the Stowell Group boardroom must have been delicious. I didn't need a microphone to hear it. I could see it in the stock ticker. Stowell Group shares dropped 12% in a single morning. The investors, a consortium of ruthless hedge funds from New York, threatened to pull their capital. The banks, sensing blood in the water, issued margin calls on the loans. The city inspectors slapped a stop work order on the gate. Citing public safety, Douglas was staring at the abyss. He was facing not just bankruptcy, but a legacy of public humiliation. The unfinished stump of the Zenith would stand as a monument to his incompetence for decades. They tried to fix it. They pumped concrete into the soil. It didn't work. They tried to counterweight the east side. It made the sinking worse. 3 weeks into the crisis, with the vultures circling, I gave the signal. Marcus, my attorney, sent a discreet inquiry to the Stowell Group's legal department. It was a simple message. Ethelgard Dynamics specializes in the impossible. We can save the Zenith. They didn't call back immediately. Douglas was proud. He viewed consultants as parasites. But as the days ticked by and the fines from the city mounted, $50,000 a day, his pride began to crumble under the weight of his ledger. On a rainy Thursday, Marcus walked into the Stowell Group headquarters, I was in his ear via a secure earpiece, listening to every breath. The conference room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fear. Douglas looked haggard. His eyes were red-rimmed. Eleonora sat beside him, looking less like a wife and more like a woman calculating her divorce settlement. "So," Douglas said, tossing Marcus's business card on the table, "you are the miracle workers. I have never heard of you." "We prefer it that way," Marcus said smoothly, taking a seat without being asked. "We operate in the shadows. Mr. Stowell, we fix the mistakes that others are too afraid to touch." "I don't have mistakes," Douglas snapped. "I have unforeseen geological complications." "Call it what you like," Marcus replied. "Your building is sinking. The city is going to condemn the site in 10 days. You will lose the land, the investment, and your reputation. We are your only option." Douglas ground his teeth. "What is the proposal?" Marcus slid a thick document across the table. "We don't use concrete. We use an active hydraulic compensation system. Sensors embedded in the foundation monitor the shift in real time. Hydraulic jacks, controlled by a proprietary AI algorithm, adjust the pressure on the pilings 24 hours a day. It doesn't just stop the sinking. Mr. Stowell, it actively pushes the building back to true vertical." Douglas looked at the schematic. He didn't understand it. He saw lines and numbers, but he didn't see the genius. He just saw a lifeline. "How much?" Douglas asked. $30 million, Marcus said. "Up front?" "That is extortion," Eleonora shrieked. "It is the cost of survival," Marcus said, unfazed. "But the money is the easy part. The terms are non-negotiable." "What terms?" Douglas asked, his eyes narrowing. "First," Marcus raised a finger, "total anonymity. You do not disclose who fixed the building. In public, you take the credit. In private, we do not exist. Second, Ethelgard Dynamics retains full operational control of the foundation system. Our engineers are the only ones allowed in the sub-basement. No Stowell employees." "Fine," Douglas waved his hand dismissively. "I don't care about the basement. I care about the spire." "And third," Marcus continued, his voice dropping an octave, "this is the most important part. The technology is not sold to you. It is licensed. You are paying for a service, not a product. The software that keeps your building standing remains the intellectual property of Ethelgard Dynamics. The license is renewable annually." Douglas paused. For a second, a flicker of instinct warned him. He was a shark, and he knew what a hook looked like. "So I am renting the foundation of my own building?" he asked. "You are renting the guarantee that it won't fall over," Marcus corrected. "If you want to pour more concrete and hope for the best, be my guest. But the city inspector is coming on Monday." Douglas looked at the clock. He looked at the plummeting stock chart on the screen behind him. He looked at Eleonora, who gave a frantic nod. He picked up the pen. "Where do I sign?" I watched the pen touch the paper through the hidden camera lens in Marcus's briefcase. My heart hammered against my ribs, not with fear, but with the dark thrill of a hunter closing the trap. He didn't read Clause 13.5. No one ever reads Clause 13.5, Clause 13. 5 stated that in the event of a breach of contract by the client, including early termination or failure to act in good faith, the licensor reserved the right to revoke the software license immediately and without notice. In layman's terms, I held the remote control to his building's legs, and he had just handed me the batteries. The work began 48 hours later. My team moved in like a special ops unit. We cordoned off the lower levels. We installed the jacks, the sensors, the miles of fiber optic cable. I was there, disguised as a safety inspector in a hard hat and reflective vest, standing 5 feet away from my father as he toured the site. He looked right through me. He didn't see Abigail the daughter. He saw a worker ant. The system went live 2 months later. It was a marvel of modern engineering. The moment we activated the hydraulics, the building groaned, a deep, resonant sound like a waking giant. Over the course of 48 hours, the zenith corrected itself. The laser plumb lines moved back to center. The tilt vanished. The construction resumed. The zenith rose, floor by floor, conquering the sky. When the final beam was placed, topping out at 110 stories, the city celebrated. The Stowell Group stock rebounded and then soared to all-time highs. Douglas was hailed as a visionary who had overcome nature's challenges. But the building was on a leash, every second of every day. My servers processed data from the zenith, every gust of wind off Lake Michigan, every shift in the clay, every vibration from the subway was countered by my machines. The building stood because I allowed it to stand. The relationship between Stowell Group and Ethelgard became complicated. Tiffany, eager to prove her worth in her new role, was assigned as the liaison. She tried to charm us. She sent baskets of expensive wine to our P.O. box. She sent emails requesting lunch meetings with the CEO of Ethelgard to discuss synergy. I had my secretary reply with automated rejections. The principal is unavailable. The principal does not do lunch. The principal declines your invitation to the gala. It drove Tiffany mad. She was used to doors opening for her. She couldn't understand why a vendor, because that is all we were to them, a glorified maintenance crew, would treat the Stowell heiress with such cold indifference. She complained to Douglas that we were arrogant tech nerds, but Douglas didn't care. The building was standing, the tenants were paying rent, the cash was flowing. 6 months after the opening of the Zenith, I sat in my penthouse living room. The lights were off. The only illumination came from the massive television screen on the wall. It was a documentary on the Discovery Channel titled Titans of Steel, The Building of the Zenith. Douglas was on screen, wearing a hard hat that looked pristine, standing on the observation deck of the tower I had saved. The wind whipped his jacket as he gestured to the city below. "People told me it couldn't be done," Douglas said to the camera, his voice thick with unearned gravitas. "They said the ground was too soft. They said the engineering was impossible. But I have a philosophy. I don't listen to no. I listen to my gut. I knew this building wanted to rise. I just had to give it the strength to do so. It takes a certain kind of genius to see the structure inside the chaos." I took a sip of my wine. It was a vintage Cabernet, dark as blood. "Genius," I repeated softly to the empty room, on the screen. The camera panned to Tiffany, who stood beside him. "My father is an inspiration," she chirped. "He taught me that you build your legacy with your own 2 hands. I laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. They were standing on a platform held up by my mind. They were breathing air at 2,000 feet, because I had calculated the shear force that allowed them to be there. Every inch of that tower, from the sub-basement to the lightning rod, was a testament to the daughter they had thrown away. I picked up my tablet. I opened the control app for the Ethelgard Active Stabilization System. On the screen was a digital twin of the Zenith. It glowed green, indicating all systems were nominal. In the bottom right corner, there was a red button labeled Emergency Lockdown/License Revocation. My thumb hovered over it for a second. Just a second. "Not yet," I whispered. "Let them get comfortable. Let them fill the building with their most prestigious tenants. Let them bet their entire future on this one asset." I closed the app and looked back at the TV. Douglas was raising a glass of champagne to the camera. "To the Zenith," he said. "To the future that belongs to the Stowell family. To the fall," I toasted back, clinking my glass against the cold air. The trap was not just set, it was armed, and they were dancing right on the trigger plate. The morning after the gala, the sun rose over Chicago with a deceptive brightness. It was the kind of sharp, brittle sunlight that often precedes a deep freeze, bouncing off the glass canyons of the Loop and making everything look clean, new, and forgiven. Inside the boardroom of the Stowell Group, the mood was euphoric. I was not there physically. Of course, I was sitting in my office across the river, watching the feed from a pinhole camera hidden in the smoke detector above the conference table. I had installed it 6 months ago during a routine maintenance check of the fire suppression system. To them, I was a ghost. To me, they were reality television. Douglas sat at the head of the table, nursing a black coffee. He looked tired but smug. the adrenaline of his speech still pumping through his veins. Eleonora was scrolling through social media on her tablet, reading aloud the compliments about her dress. "The matriarch of Chicago real estate," she read. Preening. "Oh, Douglas, listen to this one. The Stowells are the modern-day Medicis. I like that. We should use that in the brochure." But it was Tiffany who commanded the room. She stood by the whiteboard, a laser pointer in her hand, dissecting the quarterly budget. She was wearing a power suit that cost more than a mid-size sedan, and her eyes were bright with the manic energy of someone who believes they have just reinvented the wheel. "The gala was a triumph," Tiffany announced, her voice tinny through my speakers. "The brand sentiment is up 40%. Investors are calling. We are untouchable." However, she paused for dramatic effect, clicking the remote to change the slide. "To maximize our profits for the next fiscal year, we need to trim the fat, and I have found a very large, very expensive piece of fat." A red circle appeared on the screen around a line item. Ethelgard Dynamics. Structural maintenance licensing fee. $5 million per year. My heart did not skip a beat. It beat harder. A slow, heavy war drum. $5 million, Tiffany said, letting the number hang in the air. "We are paying this obscure consultancy firm $5 million a year to monitor a building that is already finished." Douglas frowned, leaning forward. "They fixed the foundation, Tiffany. That fee is for the active stabilization system." "The foundation is fixed, Daddy," Tiffany said, rolling her eyes with the confidence of a fresh MBA graduate who has never held a shovel. "The concrete has cured, the ground has settled. The crisis was 2 years ago. Why are we still paying for a life support machine when the patient is healthy?" She paced the room, tapping the laser pointer against her palm. "I had my team look into it. We can hire a local engineering firm to handle the routine maintenance for $400,000 a year. That is a savings of $4.6 million. That goes directly to the bottom line. That is my bonus. That is your new yacht." Douglas looked at the numbers. I could see the greed warring with the memory of the panic he had felt 2 years ago. But greed, as I knew it would, had the home field advantage. "Are you sure?" Douglas asked. "The contract with Ethelgard was complex." "It was predatory," Tiffany corrected. "They took advantage of us when we were vulnerable. But we are not vulnerable anymore. The Zenith is the strongest building in the city. I walked through the sub-basement yesterday. The machines are just sitting there, humming. They aren't doing anything. We are paying them to watch blinking lights." "They are arrogant, too," Eleonora chimed in, not looking up from her screen. "Remember how they refused to come to the gala? Who turns down an invitation from the Stowells? They think they are better than us. I say cut them loose." Douglas nodded slowly. He was convincing himself. It was a fascinating psychological process to watch. He was rewriting history in his head, in his new version. Ethelgard hadn't saved him. They had simply been a contractor who got lucky. And now they were overstaying their welcome. "They do have that clause," Douglas muttered, "about the intellectual property." "Scare tactics," Tiffany scoffed. "Standard legal jargon. We own the building, Daddy. We own the land. We own the equipment in the basement. They can't just take the foundation back. What are they going to do? Come in here and steal the hydraulic jacks?" She laughed, and the board members chuckled with her. It was the laughter of the ignorant walking into a minefield. "Draft the letter," Douglas said, slamming his hand on the table. "Effective immediately. Tell them their services are no longer required. And tell accounting to stop the payment for this month. We are done being held hostage by tech support." "Brilliant, Daddy," Tiffany beamed. I watched them high-five. I watched them pour more coffee. I watched them celebrate the signing of their own death warrant. I turned off the monitor and spun my chair around to face the window. The sky was turning a bruised purple over the lake. The notification arrived on my phone 20 minutes later. It was a text from Marcus. They pulled the trigger. Termination notice received via email. Cited redundancy of services and cost optimization. They are giving us 24 hours to vacate our remote access protocols. I picked up my phone and dialed Marcus. He answered on the first ring. They didn't even call, Marcus said, his voice rich with amusement. They sent a PDF attachment, very impersonal. Did they read the response regarding Clause 13.5? I asked. I doubt it, Marcus replied. I just sent the acknowledgement. I told them that per their request. Ethelgard Dynamics accepts the termination. I also reminded them that under the terms of the agreement, the license for the proprietary Atlas stabilization software is tied to the service contract. Termination of the contract results in immediate revocation of the software key. And I received a reply from Tiffany herself, Marcus said. She said, and I quote, "Stop trying to upsell us. We will handle the software. Just send over the passwords." I laughed. It was a quiet sound, absorbed by the acoustic panels of my office. She thinks it's like Windows, I said. She thinks she can just keep running it without the update. The arrogance of the ignorant is a powerful drug. Abigail, Marcus said. So, what are your instructions, Madam Chairman? I looked at the Zenith Tower through the window. It stood tall and proud. Catching the last rays of the sun, it looked invincible, but I knew the truth. It was a giant balancing on a needle. Grant their wish, Marcus, I said. They want to be independent? Let them be independent. Activate the kill switch. Clause 13.5, Marcus said. Revoking license in 3, 2, 1. I hung up. I turned my attention to the second monitor on my desk. It displayed the real-time telemetry of the Zenith's foundation. For 2 years, the screen had been a hive of activity. Green lines fluctuated constantly as the 96 hydraulic jacks made micro-adjustments, countering the wind, the vibrations of the subway, and the shifting clay. The system was alive, breathing, fighting gravity 600 times a minute. Then, the command hit the server. License revoked. System halt. The green lines flatlined. It wasn't a crash. It was a freeze. The hydraulic jacks locked into their current positions. The sensors stopped transmitting data to the central processor, the active compensation algorithm. The brain that kept the building straight simply went to sleep. The Zenith was no longer an intelligent structure. It was just a pile of steel and glass sitting on unstable mud. Frozen in the configuration it happened to be in at 4 o'clock on a Tuesday. Sleep tight, I whispered. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window. The view was spectacular, but my eyes were drawn to the horizon over Lake Michigan. The weather reports had been warning about it for 2 days. A polar vortex system was dropping down from Canada, colliding with a moisture system coming up from the Gulf. They were calling it a bomb cyclone. The sky was already darkening. The wind was picking up, whipping the whitecaps on the lake into a frenzy. I could see the flags on top of the buildings starting to snap violently. Chicago is the Windy City, but that is a cute nickname for tourists. The reality is that the wind here is a physical force, a hammer that beats against the skyline. Without the active stabilization system, the Zenith was designed to sway. All skyscrapers sway, but the Zenith had a defect because of the uneven foundation. If it swayed too far to the west, it wouldn't sway back. It would list, and if the wind sustained enough pressure, that list would become a lean, and that lean would become a collapse. I checked the wind speed on my weather station, 30 miles per hour, gusting to 45. By midnight, it would be 60. I went to the kitchenette and brewed a pot of tea. Jasmine, a calming scent. My phone buzzed again. It was a notification from the Chicago Department of Buildings, a severe weather advisory. I sat back down in my chair and watched the Zenith. The lights were coming on in the offices. Thousands of people were inside that building. Lawyers working late, cleaners vacuuming carpets, executives planning their next hostile takeover. I was not a murderer. The building would not fall down tonight. The safety factors I had built into the mechanical locks would hold it for a while. But it would be uncomfortable. It would be terrifying. And by tomorrow morning, when the storm truly hit, the Stowell family would realize that they hadn't just fired a contractor, they had fired gravity. I took a sip of tea. The liquid was hot, grounding me. Across the river, in the penthouse of the Zenith, I could see the lights of Douglas's office. He was probably pouring a scotch, toasting his own brilliance, completely unaware that the floor beneath his feet was now dead weight. "You wanted to cut costs, Father," I said to the glass. "I just made the price zero. Let's see if you can afford it." The first heavy gust of wind hit my window, rattling the pane. The storm had arrived, and for the first time in 2 years, the Zenith was facing it alone. The wind arrived exactly 48 hours after the email. It did not knock. It slammed into the city of Chicago with the subtlety of a freight train derailment. The meteorologists had upgraded the system to a bomb cyclone, a term that sounded hyperbolic until the first gusts of 60 miles per hour began to strip the siding off the older brownstones in Lincoln Park. The sky turned a bruised, sickly gray, erasing the horizon line where the lake met the clouds. From my vantage point in the penthouse across the river, I watched the storm front collide with the skyline. Rain lashed against my floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the glass into a blurred waterfall. But my eyes were not on the weather. They were fixed on the Zenith. Without the active hydraulic compensation system, the Zenith was no longer a marvel of engineering. It was a 110-story tuning fork. Most skyscrapers are designed to sway. It is a necessary flexibility. If they were too rigid, they would snap, but the sway is meant to be controlled, dampened by mass-tuned dampers, or, in the case of the Zenith, by the Ethelgard active stabilization matrix. The matrix was the inner ear of the building, constantly adjusting its balance to keep the movement imperceptible to the human occupants. But now, the inner ear is dead. I had severed the nerve. At 2 p.m, the sustained winds hit 50 miles per hour. Inside the Zenith, the laws of physics began to collect their debt. I had tapped into the internal security feed of the building, a backdoor access I had programmed into the system years ago. I watched the lobby cameras on my monitor. At first, it was subtle. The water in the decorative fountain near the reception desk began to slosh rhythmically, spilling over the marble rim. Then, the hanging art installation, a massive mobile of suspended glass spheres, began to chime. It wasn't the gentle tinkering of wind chimes. It was a chaotic clatter as the heavy glass orbs smashed into one another. On the 80th floor, where the high-end law firm of Sterling Cooper had just moved in, the panic was starting. I could see it on the localized feeds. A secretary stood up from her desk, stumbling sideways as the floor tilted beneath her feet. She grabbed the edge of a filing cabinet, her face draining of color. The sway of a building is usually measured in inches. Today, the Zenith was moving in feet, and because of the foundation defect, the uneven settling that my father had tried to bury with cheap concrete, the building wasn't just swaying back and forth, it was twisting. It was a corkscrew motion, a sickening, lurching rotation that played havoc with the human equilibrium. The phone lines at the City of Chicago Department of Buildings lit up. Tenants were calling 911, screaming that the building was falling down. I zoomed in on the camera feed for the building management system room in the sub-basement. This was the heart of the machine. 3 of the Stowell Group's junior engineers were running around like rats in a flooding cage. They were frantically typing on the main control consoles. I could see the sweat staining the back of their shirts. One of them, a young man named Kevin, who I knew had only been hired 6 months ago, was slamming his hand against the monitor. I knew exactly what he was seeing. On every screen in that control room, on every diagnostic tablet, and on the main interface wall, there was no data. There were no pressure readings. There were no hydraulic flow charts. There was only a black background with bold, red text, license revoked, proprietary algorithms suspended per terms of service, system lockdown active, contact administrator, Ethelgard Dynamics. Kevin grabbed a hardline phone and dialed. I watched him scream into the receiver. He was likely calling the operations director, or perhaps Tiffany directly. He slammed the phone down. He tried to manually override the hydraulic valves. He grabbed a breaker bar and tried to force the wheel of the main pressure line. It wouldn't budge. The magnetic locks I had installed were engaged. They were rated to withstand 10,000 pounds of force, without the digital key. Those valves would stay closed until the end of time. Up in the boardroom on the 100th floor, the situation was less technical and more visceral. Douglas Stowell was gripping the edge of his mahogany table. The sway up there was pronounced, every 4 seconds. The horizon in the window would dip and rise. Dip and rise. A vase of fresh lilies slid across the polished surface of the table and shattered on the floor. Tiffany was screaming at someone on her cell phone. "What do you mean you can't get in?" she shrieked. "Hack it. Bypass it. We own the damn system." She listened for a moment, and then her face went white. She threw the phone onto the sofa. "They are locked out," she told her father, her voice trembling. "The engineers say the code is encrypted. They can't even see the operating system. It just says, 'License revoked.'" "Call them!" Douglas roared. He tried to stand up, but a sudden lurch of the building threw him back into his chair. "Call that lawyer. Call Marcus." "I tried," Tiffany cried. "I have called him 10 times. It goes straight to voicemail. I sent emails. I sent texts. They are ghosting us." "Fix it," Douglas bellowed, his composure shattering along with the vase. "I don't care what it costs. Get them on the phone." Suddenly, a sound cut through the room. It was not a phone. It was the building itself. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the steel skeleton of the tower. It sounded like a whale dying in the deep ocean. It was the sound of steel girders flexing beyond their comfort zone. The color left Douglas's face. He knew that sound. Any man who has spent 40 years in construction knows that sound. It is the sound of structural distress. "Get everyone out," Douglas whispered. "What?" Tiffany asked. "Evacuate the building." Douglas screamed, his eyes wide with terror. "Pull the fire alarm, now!" The alarm began to blare, a harsh, rhythmic honking that synchronized with the nauseating sway of the floor. I watched the evacuation from my monitors. It was chaos. The elevators had automatically shut down. Another safety feature of my software that triggered when the sway exceeded safe limits. That meant 3,000 people had to walk down as many as 100 flights of stairs in a building that was moving like a metronome. By 5 in the evening, the Zenith was the lead story on every news channel in America. CNN had a helicopter in the air, braving the winds to get a shot of the tower. The reporter was shouting over the roar of the rotor blades. "We are getting reports of mass evacuations at the newly christened Zenith Tower," the reporter yelled. "Witnesses say the building is swaying violently. There are unconfirmed reports of structural cracks appearing in the drywall on the lower levels. The Department of Buildings has just declared a catastrophic safety hazard zone around the perimeter." I looked at the stock ticker on my third monitor. Stowell Group, STWL. At 9 in the morning, it had been trading at $84 a share. Now, it was in freefall. $60, $55, $48. Every time the ticker refreshed, another $100 million of my father's net worth evaporated into the ether. The market reacts to uncertainty with fear, but it reacts to structural failure with annihilation. The phone on my desk began to ring. It was not my business line. It was not the encrypted line I used with Marcus. It was a cheap, prepaid burner phone that I kept in the bottom drawer of my desk. I had owned that number for 16 years. It was the number I had when I was a teenager, the number I had when I was a student. I had never changed it. Solely for this moment, I picked it up. The caller ID flashed a name I hadn't seen in over a decade. Eleonora. I let it ring 3 times. 4. I wanted her to sweat. I wanted her to wonder if I was even alive. On the 5th ring, I answered, "Hello?" My voice was calm, indifferent. "Abigail?" The voice on the other end was shrill, panicked, and breathless. "Is that you? My God, why do you still have this awful number?" "Hello, Eleonora," I said, taking a sip of my jasmine tea. "To what do I owe the pleasure? I am in the middle of dinner." "Dinner?" she screeched. "How can you be eating? Have you seen the news? Your father is ruining us. I don't watch the news much, I lied. What is happening? The tower, she yelled. The zenith. It is shaking apart. The engineers are saying something about a computer lock. The system won't work. That sounds unfortunate, I said. But I don't see what it has to do with me. I am just an unemployed dropout, remember? Listen to me, you ungrateful girl, Eleonora snapped, reverting to her natural state of condescension even in the face of disaster. You always hung around those dirty people, the construction workers, the grease monkeys. I believe they prefer to be called tradesmen, I corrected. Whatever, she shouted. You must know someone. Do you have a friend who knows computers? Like a hacker or a mechanic? Someone who can come down here and break into a mainframe? Your father is going insane. He is screaming about lawsuits. We need someone to override the system manually. I paused. I looked at the screen where the red words, license revoked, were still pulsing like a heartbeat. You want me to find you a handyman to fix a billion-dollar neural network? I asked. I am offering to pay, Eleonora said, desperate. I will pay them $5,000. Cash. Just find me a nerd who can crack a password. The insult was so pure, so perfectly Eleonora. She thought the most sophisticated structural AI in the world could be fixed by a friend of her stepdaughter for a few $1,000s. She thought technology was just manual labor with a screen. I don't know any computer repairmen, Eleonora, I said slowly, savoring the words. Useless, she spat. I knew it. You are absolutely useless. Why did I even call you? You are probably sitting in some basement apartment laughing at us. I am not laughing, I said. And I don't know a repairman, but what? She demanded. I do know the person who holds the keys to the zenith, I said. There was a silence on the line. The wind howled against my window, punctuating the moment. Who? Eleonora asked, her voice dropping. Who is it? Give me the name. Douglas will call them. You don't need to call them, I said. They are already watching. What are you talking about? Who is it? Goodbye. Eleonora, I said. Stay warm. It sounds like it is going to be a cold night. I pressed the red button on the phone and ended the call. I placed the phone back in the drawer and slid it shut. On the monitors, the chaos was escalating. Police cars were barricading the streets for 6 blocks around the tower. The flashing blue lights reflected off the wet pavement, creating a kaleidoscope of panic. I stood up and walked to the window. The zenith was dark now, except for the emergency strobes flashing in the stairwells. It looked like a dying beast, shivering in the storm. My father had built a monument to his vanity, but he had forgotten the most basic rule of architecture. You cannot build a legacy on a foundation you do not own. He thought he could rent stability. He thought he could lease safety, and he thought he could discard the people who provided it the moment the bill came due. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was my encrypted business line. Marcus? I said, answering on speaker. We just got a frantic email from the Stowell Group's general counsel, Marcus said. They are threatening to sue us for sabotage, domestic terrorism, and breach of contract. They are demanding we turn the system back on immediately. And I told them that our offices are closed for the evening due to the severe weather, Marcus said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I also attached a copy of the contract they signed, with clause 13.5 highlighted in neon yellow. I told them that since the contract was terminated by the client, any new service agreement would have to be negotiated from scratch. Good, I said. Let them sit in the dark for tonight. Let them feel every inch of that sway. The stock is down 30% in after-hours trading, Marcus noted. The banks are already calling emergency meetings. They are going to seize the asset. Abigail, if that building is declared unsafe, the bank takes the keys tomorrow morning. Not if we get there first, I said. What is the play? Prepare the helicopter, I said. Tomorrow morning, at 9 sharp, we are going to pay a visit to the neighbors. You are going to reveal yourself? Marcus asked. No, I said. looking at the reflection of my own face in the glass, a face that had once been terrified of the man across the river. I am not going to reveal myself. I am going to introduce them to the new landlord. I looked back at the zenith. The sway seemed to be getting worse. The storm was far from over. "Let it shake," I whispered. "Let it shake, until the only thing left standing is the truth." The digital chime that pierced the silence of the Stowell boardroom at 3 a.m. was not loud, but in the tension of the room, it sounded like a gavel striking wood. My father was slumped in his chair, a half-empty bottle of scotch sitting on a coaster that cost more than my first car. Eleonora was pacing the carpet, her heels making a frantic staccato rhythm that betrayed her exhaustion. Tiffany was curled up on the leather sofa, doom-scrolling through the plummeting stock projections on her phone. They were waiting for the end. They were waiting for the city to call and condemn the building. Then, the email arrived. It landed in Tiffany's inbox with a soft ping. She looked at it, her eyes widening, and then she scrambled upright, nearly dropping the device. "It is them!" she gasped. "It is Ethelgard!" Douglas's head snapped up. "What do they say? Are they suing us?" "No," Tiffany said, reading rapidly, her breath catching in her throat. Subject line: Proposal for reinstatement. Body text: The CEO of Ethelgard Dynamics acknowledges your request for dialogue. In light of the severity of the situation at the Zenith, we are willing to negotiate a new term of service. Thank God, Eleonora breathed, clutching her pearls in a gesture that looked rehearsed. I knew they would break. They need our money. Keep reading, Douglas commanded, his voice raspy from smoke and stress. Our CEO requires a face-to-face meeting with the board of directors of the Stowell Group. Tiffany read. The meeting will take place tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp. Location: the Ethelgard Global Headquarters. Attendance is mandatory for all primary shareholders. They want us to come to them? Douglas bristled, his ego bruising even as he was being rescued. We are the clients. They should come to us. Daddy, the building is tilting, Tiffany snapped. We go where they tell us to go. Look, there is an address attached. She tapped the link. A map appeared on the screen. Wait, Tiffany frowned. This must be a mistake. This address is the Clarion building. The Clarion? Douglas asked. The Art Deco place across the river? That is a residential building. It is landmarked. There are no offices there. Maybe they own a floor, Eleonora suggested. Or maybe the CEO lives there and works from home. You know how these tech people are. They wear pajamas and work from living rooms. It is the penthouse, Tiffany confirmed, zooming in on the map. The entire top floor. Do you know how much that real estate is worth? That unit hasn't been on the market in 15 years. A wave of relief washed over the room, displacing the fear. It was pathetic to watch. The moment they realized the other party had money, real money, prestigious money, their terror evaporated, replaced by a greedy curiosity. In their world, wealth equaled rationality. If the CEO of Ethelgard was rich enough to own the Clarion penthouse, then he was a man they could do business with. He was one of them. So, Douglas said, straightening his tie and smoothing back his silver hair, he wants to play power games. He wants to drag us to his castle to show off. Fine, we will go. We will flatter him. We will offer him an extra $1 million a year, and we will get the system turned back on before the market opens. I will handle the negotiation, Tiffany said, her confidence rebounding with sickening speed. I speak tech, bro. I know how to stroke their egos. Find out who he is, Douglas ordered. I don't walk into a room blind. If we are meeting him in 6 hours, I want a dossier. I am on it, Tiffany said. She pulled out her phone and dialed a number. It was a private investigator she used to spy on her ex-boyfriends. I watched her through the security camera, listening to her give the instructions. I need a name, she whispered into the phone. The owner of the penthouse at the Clarion building. Also, find out who owns Ethelgard Dynamics. I need a photo, a bio, net worth. I need it in an hour. I sat in my office across the river, watching the scene play out on my monitor. The storm outside was still raging, hammering against the glass, but inside my sanctuary, it was silent. I took a sip of water. "Dig deep, Tiffany," I whispered. "See what you find." 2 hours later, Tiffany's investigator called back. She put him on speakerphone. "Well?" she demanded. "Who is he? Is it Musk? Is it some Silicon Valley dropout?" "It is a ghost, Ms. Stowell," the investigator's voice crackled. "The deed to the penthouse is held by a blind trust registered in the Cayman Islands. The company, Ethelgard, is owned by a holding company in Zurich, which is owned by another entity in Singapore." "Someone has to sign the checks," Douglas shouted at the phone. "I found a signature on a zoning permit from 10 years ago," the investigator said. "It is just initials. A.H. A.H.?" Tiffany repeated. She stood up and began to pace, her mind spinning wildly, connecting dots that didn't exist. A.H. Think, Daddy. Who in the tech world has those initials and enough money to buy the Clarion penthouse? Arthur Holmes? Eleonora guessed. The British semiconductor magnate? "He died last year," Douglas said. "Wait," Tiffany stopped. Her eyes lit up with the fervor of a conspiracy theorist who thinks she has cracked the code. "Aldous Huxley. No, that is a writer. Aaron Hale, the guy who invented that encryption software. He vanished 5 years ago. Rumor was he moved to Chicago." "It fits," Douglas said, latching on to the fantasy. "Reclusive, brilliant, probably socially awkward. That explains why he wouldn't meet us before. He is probably afraid of crowds." "An eccentric billionaire," Tiffany said, a predatory smile spreading across her face. "Perfect. I can work with that. I will wear the blue dress, the one that makes me look vulnerable but intellectual." "Get some sleep," Douglas said, pouring himself another drink. "Tomorrow, we will meet Mr. Hale, and we buy our lives back." They were so happy. They had constructed an entire persona for their savior, a man, a genius, someone they could manipulate with charm and money. I turned off the monitor. The sun would be up in 3 hours. I had work to do. I walked into my private archive room. It was climate-controlled, lined with rows of filing cabinets. I did not need blueprints tonight. I did not need engineering schematics or load-bearing calculations. I walked to the section labeled Financial Instruments, Distressed Assets. I pulled out a thick black binder. Inside was the paper trail of my vengeance. It contained the promissory notes for the Stowell Group's loans, purchased from the banks for 60 cents on the dollar. It contained the liens on their equipment. It contained the mortgage on the Stowell mansion, which I had quietly acquired through a shell company 6 months ago when Douglas refinanced to pay for the Zenith's cost overruns. I ran my fingers over the documents. They were heavy, dense with legal language. These were not just papers. They were the chains my father had forged for himself. Link by link, year by year. I placed the binder on my desk. Then, I went to my dressing room. For the last 14 years, my wardrobe had been a uniform of invisibility. Black turtlenecks, gray slacks, denim, clothes designed to deflect attention, clothes that said I am just a worker. Tonight, I pushed those hangers aside. In the back of the closet, protected by a garment bag, was a suit I had bought in Milan 3 years ago. I had never worn it. I was saving it for the funeral of the Stowell Group. I unzipped the bag. It was white, not cream, not ivory. It was a stark, blinding, surgical white. It was an Armani Privé pantsuit, tailored to within a millimeter of perfection. The fabric was crisp, sharp enough to cut. I put it on. The trousers fell in a perfect line to the floor. The jacket cinched at the waist, creating a silhouette of absolute authority. Against the white fabric, my dark hair looked like ink. I looked in the full-length mirror. The woman staring back was not the girl who had shivered in a coat 2 sizes too big on a winter night. She was not the dishwasher. She was not the welder. She was a force of nature. I reached into my jewelry box. I did not like diamonds. They were cold and impersonal. Instead, I picked up a small velvet pouch. Inside was a brooch. It was old. the silver tarnished in the crevices. Shaped like a rising phoenix, the eyes were too small, rough-cut rubies. My mother had worn this pin every day of her life. It was the only thing of value she had owned. On the day of her funeral, Douglas had gathered her things to give to Goodwill. He had held this brooch in his hand and sneered, "Cheap costume trash." He had said, "Doesn't even match the decor." He had tossed it into the trash bin. I was 10 years old. I had waited until he left the room, and then I had dug through the garbage to find it. I had cleaned the coffee grounds off it and hidden it in a hollowed-out book. It had traveled with me to the homeless shelter. It had traveled with me to the welding shop. It had traveled with me to the penthouse. I pinned the phoenix to the lapel of my white jacket. The red eyes of the bird seemed to glow against the white fabric. It was a message. They wouldn't understand it. Not at first, but they would feel it. I checked my watch. It was 7 in the morning. The storm had passed, leaving the sky a bruised, clear blue. The wind had died down, but the damage was done. The city was awake, and the headlines were screaming about the zenith. I walked to the window one last time. Across the river, I could see the black SUVs lining up in front of the Stowell headquarters. They were coming. They were coming to meet A.H. They were coming to meet Arthur Holmes, or Aaron Hale, or whatever savior they had invented in their minds. I touched the cold glass. "You are looking for a man to save you," I whispered. "But you are going to find the daughter you tried to kill." I turned away from the window. I picked up the black binder. I picked up my phone. I looked at myself in the mirror one last time. I straightened the phoenix brooch. "Goodbye, Abigail," I said to the reflection. "You were a good girl. You worked hard. You tried to please them, but you are too soft for what comes next." I took a breath, inhaling the silence of the room. "Mrs. Hartman," I said, testing the name on my tongue. It tasted like iron. "You have the floor." I walked out of the dressing room, my heels clicking on the polished concrete floor, echoing like the ticking of a clock that had finally run out of time. The elevator was waiting. The cage was open. It was time to feed the lions. The elevator ride to the penthouse of the Clarion building took 45 seconds. I knew this because I had programmed the lift speed myself to ensure a smooth, gravity-defying ascent that felt less like mechanical movement and more like levitation. I was not in the elevator. I was standing inside the boardroom, my back to the door, looking out through the massive pane of one-way glass that made up the entire north wall. From here, Chicago looked like a circuit board, humming with energy, and directly in my line of sight, across the river, stood the zenith. Even from this distance, I could see the emergency strobes flashing in its windows. It looked like a distress signal sent by a dying ship. I watched the monitor on the wall to my left. It showed the interior of the elevator cab. Douglas, Eleonora, and Tiffany stood in the small, wood-paneled box. They were trying to look like masters of the universe, but the camera caught the tremors in their hands. Douglas was adjusting his tie for the 10th time. Eleonora was checking her reflection in the brass control panel, frantically smoothing the wrinkles around her eyes. Tiffany was holding a thick portfolio, rehearsing her pitch under her breath. "Remember," Douglas said, his voice tinny through the speaker, "we do not apologize. We frame it as a partnership opportunity. We tell Mr. Hale that we are doing him a favor by letting him fix the glitch." "He will listen," Tiffany said, sounding like she was trying to convince herself. "Tech guys love validation. I will tell him his code is disruptive. They love that word." The elevator doors opened into the reception area of Ethelgard Dynamics. I had designed this space to be the antithesis of the Stowell Group's headquarters. My father's office was all mahogany, red velvet, and gold leaf, a desperate scream of old money. My office was silent. The floors were polished concrete that looked like black water. The walls were raw steel. The lighting was recessed and clinical. There was no receptionist, just a single, floating desk made of glass. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Lena, who had been with me for 5 years, was waiting for them. She wore black, blending into the shadows. "Welcome to Ethelgard," Lena said. Her voice was cool, professional. and devoid of warmth. "We are here to see the CEO," Douglas announced, stepping forward and puffing out his chest. "I am Douglas Stowell. We have an appointment at 9 o'clock. "The principal is expecting you," Lena said. "Please follow me. However, before we proceed, I must collect all electronic devices, phones, smartwatches, tablets, and recording pens." Douglas bristled. "Excuse me? I am not a tourist visiting a museum. I am the chairman of the Stowell Group. I need my phone for business." "And the principal requires a secure environment," Lena replied, not blinking. "It is non-negotiable. You may leave your devices here, or you may leave the building. The choice is yours." Douglas looked at Tiffany. Tiffany looked at the floor. They knew they had no leverage. The zenith was swaying in the wind, and every minute they wasted was a minute closer to bankruptcy. "Fine," Douglas spat. He pulled his phone from his pocket and slammed it onto a velvet tray Lena held out. Eleonora reluctantly handed over her phone, muttering about expecting a call from her stylist. Tiffany surrendered her tablet and her smartwatch. "Thank you," Lena said. "Follow me." She led them down the long, dimly lit corridor that connected the reception to the main boardroom. The hallway was designed to disorient. The walls were slightly angled, creating a forced perspective that made the destination seem further away than it was. It was a psychological trick to make visitors feel small before they even sat down. I moved to the head of the conference table. The room was vast, dominated by a 20-foot table made of a single slab of petrified wood. There were only 4 chairs, one for me at the head, and 3 on the opposite side, facing the window, facing the zenith. I sat down. I placed the black binder on the table in front of me. I folded my hands. The heavy steel door hissed open. Douglas walked in first, his eyes immediately scanning the room, looking for a man. He looked right past me. His gaze swept the corners, the window, looking for Arthur Holmes or Aaron Hale. Eleonora followed, her eyes widening as she took in the view. "My God," she whispered. "Look at the city. You can see everything." Tiffany brought up the rear. She was the first one to actually look at the person sitting in the chair. She stopped dead in her tracks. I sat perfectly still. The white Armani suit seemed to glow in the ambient light. The phoenix brooch on my lapel caught a ray of sun and flared red. For 5 seconds, there was silence. It was not a respectful silence. It was the silence of a brain misfiring, trying to reconcile 2 incompatible data points. Then, Tiffany laughed. It was a sharp, incredulous bark of laughter. She stepped forward, shaking her head, her face twisting into a sneer of absolute contempt. "What the hell are you doing here?" Tiffany asked. Her voice echoed in the large room. "Did you lose your mop, Abigail? Or are you begging for a job? I didn't know you were cleaning toilets for Ethelgard now." Douglas turned. Hearing the name, he looked at me, and his face flushed a deep, violent purple. "Abigail," he roared. "You, get out! Get out immediately!" He marched toward the table, his finger raised. "I don't know how you sneaked past security, but you are leaving now. We have a meeting with the CEO of this company in 2 minutes. Do you have any idea how much embarrassment you are causing me? If Mr. Hale walks in and sees my failures of a daughter sitting in his chair—" "I said get out," Douglas shouted, slamming his hand on the table near my binder. "Go wait in the car, or better yet, go back to whatever gutter you crawled out of. I will not have you ruin this deal." "She probably broke in," Eleonora chimed in, clutching her handbag. "She is trying to sabotage us. Douglas, look at her, wearing a white suit like she is someone important. It probably came from a costume shop. Abigail, have you no shame?" I did not move. I did not blink. I just watched them. I watched the veins pulsing in my father's neck. I watched the frantic malice in Tiffany's eyes. I watched the fear disguised as snobbery in Eleonora. "You are deaf as well as stupid," Tiffany spat. "Move! The CEO is coming!" The door behind them opened again. Marcus walked in. He was impeccable in a navy pinstripe suit, carrying a leather attaché case. He walked past the Stowells as if they were furniture. He did not look at Douglas. He did not look at Tiffany. He walked straight to the head of the table. He stopped next to my chair. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of genuine respect, not servitude. "Apologies for the delay, Madam Chairman," Marcus said, his voice clear and resonant. He opened his case and placed a stack of documents in front of me. "These are the execution papers for the revocation of the Zenith license, as you requested, and the acquisition files for the Stowell Group's outstanding debt." The silence that followed was different. It was heavy. It was physical. It sucked the air out of the room. Douglas froze. His hand was still hovering over the table where he had struck it. He looked at Marcus. Then he looked at me. He looked at the binder. He looked at the white suit. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was a fish gasping on a dock. Eleonora let out a small, strangled whimper. Her fingers went slack. Her Hermes Birkin bag slipped from her grasp and hit the floor with a heavy thud, spilling a lipstick and a compact mirror that rolled across the concrete. Tiffany was the only one who spoke, but her voice was a whisper, stripped of all its previous arrogance. "Chairman?" she squeaked. No, that's Abigail. That's just Abigail." I slowly unclasped my hands. I reached out and opened the black binder. I turned the first page. The sound of the crisp paper turning loud in the dead silence. Then I looked up. I looked directly into my father's eyes. "Hello, Father," I said. My voice was not the voice he remembered. It was not the shaky, pleading voice of the 20-year-old girl begging for tuition money. It was low, modulated, and terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a woman who commanded an empire. "Welcome to the office of the useless daughter," I said. Douglas took a step back, staggering as if he had been physically struck. He grabbed the back of one of the guest chairs to steady himself. "You," he rasped. "You are Ethelgard?" "Ethelgard Dynamics," I said, savoring the syllables. "Do you know what the name means, Father?" "It is Old English. It means noble fortress. It is a place where structure matters, where the foundation is respected, where we don't cheat on the concrete." "This is a joke," Tiffany stammered. She looked wildly around the room, as if expecting a hidden camera crew to jump out. "This is a prank. You can't be the CEO. You don't know anything. You didn't even finish college." "I finished 3 degrees," I said, my eyes sliding to her, "including a master's in structural engineering from Zurich, while you were learning how to post selfies at Yale. Tiffany, I was learning how to keep buildings from falling down." "But the technology," Douglas whispered, "the active stabilization, the AI, that is genius-level work. That is billions of dollars." "Yes," I said, "it is. And for the last 2 years, you have been renting my genius to hold up your ego." I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. I walked around the table to the window. I stood with my back to them for a moment, looking at the zenith. "Come here," I commanded. They didn't move. I said, "Come here," I repeated, my voice sharpening like a blade. Slowly, mesmerized by shock, they walked to the window. They stood beside me, looking out. "Look at it," I said, pointing to the swaying tower across the river. "Your masterpiece, the zenith. It is quite beautiful, isn't it? From the outside." "Fix it," Douglas pleaded, his voice cracking. "Abigail, please. It is going to collapse. People will die." I turned to face them. "People won't die, Father," I said. "I am not you. I don't gamble with human lives to save money on rebar. The building is in safety lockdown. The elevators are grounded. The fire suppression is active. But the structure? The structure is in pain. It is twisting because you built it on a lie." "We didn't know," Eleonora sobbed. "We just did what the accountant said." "You knew," I cut her off cold. "You always knew. Just like you knew when you framed me for the collapse 14 years ago. Just like you knew when you burned my acceptance letter to MIT. Douglas looked at me, his eyes wet. "That was for your own good. I was trying to teach you reality. And you succeeded. I smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach my eyes. You taught me that the only reality in this family is power. You taught me that love is conditional, and respect is bought. So, I bought it. I walked back to the table and picked up the binder Marcus had brought in. I didn't just design the system that saved your tower. Douglas, I designed the trap you walked into. I tossed the binder onto the table. It slid across the polished wood and stopped right in front of him. Open it, I said. Douglas opened the binder with trembling hands. He stared at the first document. This is the loan from Chase Bank, he stammered. The construction loan. Look at the holder, I said. He read the fine print. Ethelgard Holdings, LLC. Turn the page, I ordered. He turned it. The mezzanine financing from Goldman. Mine, I said. The equipment leases, he read, flipping faster now, panic rising in his voice. The mortgage on the family estate in Lake Forest. The personal lines of credit. Mine, mine, mine. I recited the words like a litany. I own it all. Douglas, I own the chair you sit in at your office. I own the car you drove here. I own the house where you sleep. And as of yesterday, when you violated the terms of the service contract for the Zenith, I triggered the default clauses on all of them. Tiffany slumped into one of the chairs, looking as if she might vomit. You bought our debt? Why? Why didn't you just tell us? Because I wanted you to feel safe, I said, leaning over the table, my face inches from hers. I wanted you to climb as high as you possibly could. I wanted you to build the tallest tower in Chicago. I wanted you to stand on the very top of the world, thinking you were untouchable. I straightened up and smoothed the lapel of my white jacket. Because the fall is so much longer from up there. Abigail, Douglas whispered. He looked old. Suddenly, undeniably old, the titan of industry had vanished, leaving a scared old man in an expensive suit. We are family. You wouldn't destroy your own family. Family? I asked. I touched the phoenix brooch on my chest. You burned my family in the fireplace 14 years ago. You threw my family out into the snow. You called my family a mistake of nature in front of 500 people 3 weeks ago. I looked at Marcus. Show them the options. Marcus stepped forward. Mr. Stowell, the Zenith is currently classified as a distressed asset, without the Ethelgard license, which has been irrevocably revoked due to your termination of the contract. The building is structurally unsound. The city will condemn it by noon today. The bank, which is us, will foreclose immediately. However, Marcus continued, Chairman Hartman is generous. She has prepared a settlement offer. Settlement? Douglas looked up, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. I will pay, whatever you want, 10 million a year, 20? We don't want your money, Douglas, I said. You don't have any money. It's all mine anyway. Then what? Total surrender, I said. I pulled a single sheet of paper from the back of the binder. This is a transfer of control agreement, I explained. It transfers 100% of the voting shares of the Stowell Group to Ethelgard Dynamics. It removes you, Eleonora, and Tiffany from the board of directors effective immediately. It strips you of all executive titles, salaries, and benefits. You want my company? Douglas choked out. I want my company, I corrected. The one you built on the lies I paid for. You sign this, and I turn the system back on. The Zenith stabilizes, the tenants stay, the stock recovers, the Stowell Group survives. But we lose everything, Tiffany cried. No, I said. You lose the power, you lose the prestige, you lose the ability to hurt anyone else, but I am not a monster. I will leave you with the house. You can keep your cars. You can live out your retirement in comfort. Douglas, you just won't matter anymore. And if I don't sign? Douglas asked, his jaw setting in a last, desperate attempt at defiance. I gestured to the window, to the swaying tower. Then I do nothing, I said simply. I let nature take its course. The Zenith will be condemned. The stock will go to zero. You will be sued by every investor in New York. You will face criminal charges for the building code violations I have documented in the sub-basement. You will go to prison, Douglas, and you will die there, penniless and disgraced. I checked my watch. It is 9:15. The Department of Buildings is scheduled to issue the condemnation order at 10. You have 45 minutes. I turned my back on them and walked toward the door. Where are you going? Eleonora screamed. I have a meeting with the real engineers, I said without looking back. Marcus has the pen. Decide if you want to be a retired millionaire or a federal inmate. I really don't care which. I walked out of the room. The heavy steel door hissed shut behind me, sealing them in the glass cage with the view of their crumbling empire. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. I heard Tiffany sobbing. I heard Eleonora screaming at Douglas. And then, I heard the click of a pen. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I did not leave the room for long. I stood in the hallway just long enough to let the silence do its work, to let the weight of their own insignificance settle on their shoulders like a heavy coat. When I swiped my keycard and the steel door hissed open again, the atmosphere inside had shifted from shock to a desperate, clawing negotiation mode. Douglas had unbuttoned his jacket. He was sweating, a sheen of moisture visible on his forehead despite the climate-controlled cool of the room. He looked up as I entered, and I saw him physically rearrange his face. He smoothed the lines of anger. He forced the corners of his mouth upward. He was putting on the father mask, the one he wore for Christmas cards and campaign fundraisers. Abigail, he said, his voice dropping to a register that was meant to be soothing. Paternal. He took a step toward me, hands open, palms up. Let's all take a breath. We are emotional. I understand that. You have done incredible things, truly. I walked past him and sat on the edge of the table, looking down at him. Save the speech, Douglas. We are past the point of pleasantries. No, listen to me, he insisted, moving closer, invading my personal space with the scent of his expensive cologne, which now barely masked the smell of fear. I know I was hard on you. I was brutal. But don't you see? It was a strategy. I saw the fire in you, Abigail. I knew that if I coddled you like I did Tiffany, you would never reach your potential. I had to break you down to build you up. I was the crucible. And look at you now. You are a titan. You beat me. I am proud of you. He actually reached out to touch my arm. I did not flinch. I did not pull away. I simply looked at his hand until he felt the awkwardness and retracted it. You were hard on me to motivate me? I asked, my voice flat. Yes, Douglas nodded eagerly, thinking he had found a hook. It was tough love, the hardest kind of love a parent can give. I knew you had a genius inside you that needed to be forged in fire. Is that so? I stood up and walked over to the main control console embedded in the wall. Because I have a very good memory, Douglas, but just in case yours is failing, I brought a reminder. I tapped the screen. The room's surround sound system, which cost more than my first house, crackled to life. It was a recording from 3 weeks ago. The audio quality was crystal clear, captured by the microphone on the podium at the Palmer House Hilton. My father's voice filled the room, amplified and booming. I have a daughter who chose a different path, a path of least resistance, at 34 years old. She stands here tonight with no degree, no career, no husband. She is a lesson to the young people in this room. Without listening to your elders, you end up well. You end up empty-handed. You end up a shadow. The recording ended. The silence that followed was sharper than a knife. I turned back to him. Was that the motivation? I asked. Humiliating me in front of 500 of your peers? Calling me a shadow? Telling the world I was a mistake? Douglas opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had stepped on a landmine and was waiting for the click. You didn't do it to build me up, I said, stepping closer to him. You did it because you despised that I was the only one who saw through you. You hated that I looked at your buildings and saw the cracks, while everyone else saw the gold paint. You are a liar, Tiffany suddenly shrieked. She had been sitting in the corner, vibrating with a mix of terror and jealousy. And now she exploded. She jumped up, her face twisted and ugly. "You are a fraud," she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at me. "You didn't build this company. You stole it. You must be laundering money. There is no way you made this much money legally. You are a criminal. I bet you are sleeping with some cartel boss or some Saudi prince. That is where the money came from." I looked at my half-sister. She was wearing a dress that cost $4,000. Bought with a credit card paid for by the company accounts I now controlled. She had never worked a day in her life that didn't involve a lunch meeting. "Tiffany," I said, my voice dangerously calm, "do you know what I was doing while you were rushing your sorority at Yale?" "Probably stripping," she spat. I walked over to her. I held up my hands. They were manicured now, soft and lotion-covered. But if you looked closely, you could see the faint, silvery scars on the knuckles. I was welding steel beams in a fabrication shop in Gary, Indiana, I said. I was working 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. I slept on a mattress on the floor of a warehouse that had no heat. I ate canned beans for dinner for 3 years. I pointed to the window, to the city skyline. While you were spending $50,000 of the company's money on your wellness retreat in the Maldives last year, I was pulling an all-nighter analyzing the wind shear data for the Zenith Foundation. While you were buying followers on Instagram to boost your personal brand, I was buying your father's debt. I leaned in close to her face. I didn't steal this money, Tiffany. I bled for it. I earned every single cent. And the reason you can't believe it is because the concept of earning is as foreign to you as empathy. Tiffany burst into tears. It was a tantrum, pure and simple. She stomped her foot. "It's not fair. Daddy, do something. She is being mean to me." Douglas looked at his daughter. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of realization in his eyes. He looked at the weeping, useless woman he had created, and then he looked at me. The contrast was brutal. "Enough," I said. I walked back to the head of the table. "Marcus," I commanded. "The terms." Marcus slid a single document across the polished wood. It stopped in front of Douglas. "This is the transfer of control agreement," I said. "It is very simple. You transfer 100% of the equity and voting rights of the Stowell Group to Ethelgard Dynamics." "For how much?" Douglas asked, his voice hollow. "What is the buyout price?" $1, I said. $1? Douglas choked. "The assets alone are worth $2 billion. "The assets are leveraged to the hilt," I corrected him. "And the liabilities, specifically the liability of a collapsing tower that you built with negligence, are catastrophic. The company is worthless. Douglas, actually, it is worth less than zero. I am doing you a favor by taking the debt off your hands." "I won't sign it," Douglas said, gripping the edge of the table. "I built that company. It is my name on the door." "Then don't sign," I said, shrugging. And here is what happens next. In 30 minutes, the Department of Buildings condemns the Zenith. The news hits the wire. The stock goes to zero by lunch. The banks call in the loans immediately. You default, you go bankrupt, but that is the easy part. I picked up the black binder again and tapped it. The hard part is the criminal investigation. I have the original invoices. Douglas, I have the emails where you authorized the switch to grade B steel. I have the memos where you told the concrete supplier to water down the mix. That is fraud. That is criminal negligence. That is 10 to 15 years in a federal penitentiary. I looked him dead in the eye. So, the choice is yours. You can be the retired businessman who quietly sold his company to a private equity firm and faded into the sunset with his dignity intact. Or you can be the felon who destroyed the skyline. Douglas looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely hold on to the table. Suddenly, there was a thud. Eleonora had dropped to her knees. The woman who had once sneered at my shoes, who had slammed the door in my face in the middle of a blizzard, was now crawling on the polished concrete floor toward me. She grabbed the hem of my white trousers. "Abigail, please," she wailed, mascara running down her cheeks in black streaks. Please don't do this. We are family. I was a mother to you. I raised you. I looked down at her. I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, just a mild sense of hygiene concern for my suit. You were never a mother to me, Eleonora, I said. You were the woman who told me to freeze to death. You were the woman who laughed when my father burned my future. She sobbed, clutching tighter. I was jealous. I was stupid. But think of your father. He is an old man. Prison will kill him. Please, Abigail, have mercy. We will do anything. We will move away. We will disappear. Just leave us some money. Just a little bit. I pulled my leg away from her grasp, stepping back. Get up, I said coldly. You are getting foundation on my floor, and this concrete is imported. Eleonora froze. The humiliation hit her like a slap. She slowly pulled herself up, shrinking back toward the wall, looking at me as if I were a monster. You are cold, she whispered. You are ice. I am what you made me, I replied. Douglas slammed his hand on the table again, but there was no power in it this time. It was a spasm of impotence. I will sue you, he hissed. I will get the best lawyers in New York. I will tie this up in court for years. You violated the contract first. You turned off the system. That is sabotage. No judge will uphold this takeover. Is that your play? I asked. Litigation? I laughed. Douglas, look at who is standing next to me. That is Marcus. He wrote the contract. He wrote the loopholes. He designed the trap. But go ahead. Sue me. File the papers. I leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. But remember this. The moment you file a lawsuit, discovery begins, and during discovery, I will be forced to release all the technical data regarding the Zenith's construction. I will have to show the court why the building needs my system. I will have to show them the core samples. I will have to show them the cracks. I will have to show them the emails. I smiled. You are trying to threaten me with a water pistol. Douglas, while I am holding a nuclear launch code, if we go to court, the truth comes out, and the truth is the one thing you cannot survive. Douglas stared at me. He looked at the window, where the Zenith was still standing, still swaying, a monument to his greed held hostage by my vengeance. He realized then that there was no way out. The walls had closed in. The ceiling had lowered. He was in a box of his own making, and I was holding the only key. You planned this, he whispered, for years. Every single day, I confirmed. Every time I ate instant noodles, every time I worked a double shift, every time I looked at that scar on my hand from the welding torch, I was planning this moment. I pointed to the document. $1, Douglas. It is a fair price. It is $1 more than you gave me when you threw me out. The room was silent. The only sound was the wind outside, still buffeting the glass. Douglas picked up the pen. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen. He held it like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He looked at Tiffany, who was curled in a ball on the chair, weeping softly. He looked at Eleonora, who was staring at the floor, defeated. He looked at me one last time. I should have let you go to MIT, he said. It was not an apology. It was a regret of strategy. He realized that if he had just paid the tuition, he would still be the king. Yes, I said. You should have, but then I wouldn't be the woman who owns you. I tapped the signature line. Sign it, or I make the call to the city. Douglas lowered the pen to the paper. His hand shook, scratching the nib against the fiber. He signed his name. It was a messy, jagged scrawl. Nothing like the bold, arrogant signature he usually used. He pushed the paper away from him as if it were burning hot. Done, he whispered. It is yours. Take it. Take it all. I picked up the paper. I checked the signature. I checked the date. I handed it to Marcus. File it, I said, and transfer the $1 to his personal account. I want the transaction record framed. I looked at my watch. Congratulations, Douglas. You are now retired. I walked over to the console on the wall. I pressed a sequence of keys. What are you doing? Tiffany asked. looking up with red, swollen eyes. "I am keeping my end of the bargain," I said. I pressed the final key. Enter, on the screen. The red text, "License revoked," blinked once, and then vanished. It was replaced by a soothing green bar. "System reboot initiated. License restored. Active stabilization engaged. Across the river." The zenith seemed to sigh. The hydraulic jacks in the basement woke up. The pressure normalized. The sway began to dampen. I turned back to my family. My former family. "The building is safe," I said. "The company is safe. My company." I pointed to the door. "Now get out of my office. You have boxes to pack." The ink was barely dry on the paper. But the man who sat before me was no longer Douglas Stowell, the titan of Chicago real estate. He was just a tenant in a body that had suddenly become too large for his shrinking spirit. In the span of 60 minutes, he had aged 10 years. The sharp lines of his jaw seemed to slacken. His shoulders slumped under the invisible weight of the transfer of control agreement. And the light of arrogance that had burned in his eyes for 4 decades had been extinguished, replaced by a dull gray fog of disbelief. Marcus reached out and gently slid the document away from Douglas. It was done. The Stowell Group, an empire built on bluster and cut corners, now belonged to Ethelgard Dynamics. It belonged to me. "Is it over?" Eleonora whispered. She was still sitting on the floor, too broken to stand. "The transfer is complete," I said, standing up and smoothing the fabric of my white suit. "Which means we now move to the administrative phase. Marcus, please collect the corporate assets." Marcus nodded and turned to Tiffany. "Ms. Stowell," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "As of this moment, your employment as Senior Vice President of Marketing is terminated, per company policy regarding terminated executives. You must surrender all company property immediately." Tiffany wiped her eyes, smearing mascara across her cheeks. "What property? You already took my phone." "The keys," Marcus said. "The company leases a Porsche Cayenne for your use, and the corporate credit card. And the access badge to the headquarters." "I need the car to get home," Tiffany stammered. "I can't walk. It's miles away." "Uber has excellent service in this area," I interjected, my voice cool. "Or perhaps you can take the bus. I hear it is very economical. It builds character." Tiffany looked at me with pure hatred, digging into her purse. She slammed the keys and the black American Express card onto the table. "You are enjoying this, aren't you? You are sick." "I am efficient," I corrected. "And Eleonora, the credit cards linked to the Stowell Family Trust are now frozen. As the trust is a guarantor of the defaulted loans, I suggest you don't try to stop for lunch on the way home. The card will be declined." "You are leaving us with nothing," Eleonora sobbed. "I am leaving you with the house," I reminded her, "and I am leaving you with your freedom. Considering the amount of fraud buried in the sub-basement of the Zenith, you should be thanking me for not handing you over to the FBI. I pressed the intercom button on the table. "Security," I said. "Please escort the former board members to the exit. They are no longer authorized personnel." 2 large security guards entered the room. They were not rough, but they were firm. They guided the shell-shocked trio toward the elevator. Douglas stopped at the door. He turned back to look at me one last time. He looked like he wanted to scream, to curse, to throw one last punch, but he had nothing left. He just shook his head, a gesture of utter defeat, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. I stood alone in the silence of the boardroom. I walked to the window and looked at the Zenith. The sway had stopped. The building was standing tall and proud against the Chicago sky. "Now," I whispered to myself, "we clean house." The next 3 months were a bloodbath, at least according to the financial press. Everyone expected me to step in as the new CEO of the Stowell Group and run it business as usual. They expected me to keep the name, keep the brand, and just enjoy the profits. They didn't understand that I was not a businesswoman. I was a surgeon, and when a limb is gangrenous, you do not put a bandage on it. You amputate. I did not keep the Stowell Group. I dismantled it. I brought in a team of forensic accountants and structural auditors. We went through every single asset in the portfolio. If a building was sound, we kept it. If a project was built on corruption, bad zoning, or cheap materials, I sold it. I sold the strip malls. I sold the suburban housing developments that were falling apart. I sold the vanity projects. I sold them for parts. I sold the land. I sold the leases. I gutted the empire my father had spent 40 years building until there was nothing left but the bones. The industry was in shock. The Wall Street Journal ran a headline: "The Great Demolition: How Abigail Hartman is Tearing Down a Dynasty." But amidst the wreckage, I found the gold. I found the engineers, the quiet ones, the men and women who, like me, had been shouted down by Douglas and Tiffany, the ones who had tried to warn about the bad concrete, the ones who cared about the math. I called them into my office, one by one. They came in terrified, expecting to be fired. Instead, I gave them raises. I gave them equity. I told them that from now on, Ethelgard Dynamics did not answer to shareholders who wanted quick profits. We answered to physics. We answered to gravity. We build it right, I told them, or we don't build it at all. And then, there was the Zenith. It was the crown jewel, and it needed a new name. I could not let it stand as a monument to the Stowell family. I held a press conference in the lobby. It was the first time I had spoken publicly since the takeover. The flashbulbs were blinding, but I did not blink. "The Stowell Group is dead," I announced to the room of reporters. "It died of its own greed, but this building will live. We have reinforced the foundation. We have corrected the errors. And today, we are renaming it." I pointed to the banner behind me as it dropped. "The Phoenix Tower." "It rose from the ashes of incompetence," I said, "and it will stand as a symbol of integrity." The rebranding was a massive success. Tenants who had been fleeing returned, assured by the Ethelgard reputation. The stock of my holding company soared, but the real closure came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. 6 months after the takeover, I was in the lobby of the Phoenix Tower, inspecting the new security protocols. I saw a man walking toward the exit with a cardboard box in his arms. It was Douglas. I had allowed him to keep a small, remote office in the building for 3 months to clear out his personal files. A small mercy that Marcus had advised to avoid a lawsuit over personal effects. Today was his final day. He looked older than he had in the boardroom. His hair was thinner, his suit a little loose at the collar. He walked with a shuffle. He saw me and stopped. The lobby was bustling with people, young professionals, architects, clients, all walking through the space I now owned. None of them looked at him. He was a ghost in his own kingdom. "Douglas," I said, nodding my head. "Abigail," he replied. His voice was raspy. He shifted the box in his arms. It looked light, a life's work reduced to a few picture frames and a stapler. He looked around the lobby, at the new logo on the wall, at the security guards who wore my insignia. "You really did it," he said softly. "You erased us. It is like we never existed." "I didn't erase you," I said. "I just corrected the record." He looked at me, and for a moment, the old anger flared up, but it was weak, like a dying ember. "Why?" he asked. "Why were you so cruel? I offered you the company. I offered to step down. Why did you have to humiliate us? Why did you have to strip Tiffany of everything? She is working at a department store. Abigail, she is selling handbags to women she used to go to parties with. It breaks my heart." "You ask me why I'm cruel," I said, stepping closer to him. "But you are confusing cruelty with structural necessity." I gestured to the massive support columns of the lobby. "I am an architect, father. That is all I have ever been. And in architecture, when a foundation is rotten, you cannot just paint over it. You cannot just prop it up. If you leave even 1 inch of the rot, it will spread. It will bring the whole house down eventually." I looked him in the eye. "You were the rot, Douglas. You and Eleonora and the entitlement you fed Tiffany. I had to tear it all out. I had to scrape it clean. It wasn't vengeance. It was renovation. I had to break it to build something that would last. Douglas stared at me. He opened his mouth to argue, to defend himself. But he stopped. He looked at the confident, powerful woman standing in front of him. And he realized that he didn't know me. He never had. "You are cold," he whispered. "No," I said. "I am solid." I turned to the security guard standing nearby. "Please see Mr. Stowell to the revolving door and ensure his access pass is deactivated." "Yes, Madam Chairman," the guard said. Douglas walked away. He pushed through the revolving door and stepped out into the rain. I watched him go. He merged into the crowd on the sidewalk, a gray figure in a gray coat, and then he was gone, vanished into the city he thought he owned. I took the private elevator to the roof. The wind was strong up there, 110 stories above the lake. It whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't care. I walked to the edge of the parapet. Below me, Chicago was a grid of lights, beautiful and indifferent. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number. "Elias," I said when he answered. "Is it done?" The old man's voice croaked. "The trash is taken out," I said. "The building is secure. The Stowell name is gone." "Good," Elias grunted. "Now you can finally start building something of your own. No more fixing other people's mistakes." "Yes," I said. "No more mistakes." I hung up the phone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object. It was a heavy gold ring with a black onyx stone, the Stowell family crest. I had found it in Douglas's desk when I took over the office. He must have left it behind in his haste. Or perhaps he was too ashamed to wear it. It was the ring he used to knock on the table when he was angry, the ring that had flashed in the light when he burned my acceptance letter. It felt heavy in my hand, cold, dead. I held it up to the light of the city. It was just a piece of metal. It held no power anymore. The power was not in the gold. It was in the fear I had let it hold over me, and the fear was gone. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sharp, cold air of the stratosphere. "Goodbye, Dad," I whispered. I drew my arm back and threw the ring. It spun through the air, catching the light of a passing helicopter for a brief second, and then it fell into the darkness. It would tumble down 110 stories. It would bounce off the pavement or splash into the Chicago River. It didn't matter. It was just debris now. I stood there for a long time, watching the city breathe. I was 34 years old. I was the owner of the skyline. I was Abigail Hartman. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. The wind felt good. It felt like the future. I turned away from the edge, buttoned my white jacket, and walked back toward the door. I had a meeting with the Planning Commission in the morning. We were going to build something new, something that would reach the stars, and this time, the foundation would be real. Thank you so much for listening to this story of revenge and redemption. It has been a journey from the depths of betrayal to the heights of the Chicago skyline. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a bustling city like Chicago, or somewhere quiet and peaceful? Please leave a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and I love connecting with you all. If you enjoyed seeing Abigail take back her power, please make sure to subscribe to the Sunday Drama Stories channel. Hit the like button on this video, and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.